Not Sean, yet nonetheless in his absence I am teaching this class this morning, so I'm glad to see all of you. Our subject matter this morning is going to be the story of Achan, which is lesson 5 in your lesson books, and will be in Joshua 7 and 8 in your Bibles. So that is where we will be turning our attention. Before we go any further, let me talk a little bit longer to give everybody a chance to get settled. Before we go any further, I'm going to call on Josh Talbert to lead us in prayer. Josh?
Pray with me. Father, we humble ourselves before you this morning. We thank you for the good travel and the safety we've had to get here as we study your scriptures. We ask that you will help us to understand how you interact with mankind and how you desire us to interact with you as we study the stories in Joshua. Help us to identify the obedience and identify the disobedience so we can learn from the mistakes of the past. This is our prayer in your Son's name. Amen.
Amen. Thank you, brother. All right. Let's begin this morning, I think, with some reading. I'll look for a couple of volunteers here. First of all, somebody wants to read Joshua 7, 1 through 9, then Joshua 7, 10 through 26. Volunteers to read. Tony, you can have 1 through 9. Now we need 10 through 26. Volunteer for that? Joshua 7, 10 through 26. All right, Josh. Tony, read away. Thank you, brother. And thank you as well, Tony. Okay, then, let's talk about what we just read. Question 1 on page 19 of our lesson books asks, in comparison to Jericho, what kind of a city was Ai? What are we talking about here? Is this one of the great metropolises of Canaan? No. Instead, what is true of it? Small and insignificant. And I've read that to this day, when you go look at the tell where Ai was, it is obvious that the city that was there was never very large. So this is another place where we see the scriptures line up with reality, unsurprisingly. So how many men did Joshua send to conquer Ai, and why this number? Yep. They talked about sending 2,000 or 3,000, and eventually, why did they settle on 3, do you think? Random choice, maybe just a margin for error. Because if you think you need between 2 and 3, then you send that. So as an engineer, you might appreciate this. Just build in that little safety margin so that there is no chance of things going bad. But why 2,000 or 3,000 at all? Why not send the whole horde onto Ai, all 600,000 of them? Yes. Exactly it. Because this is such a small, insignificant city, it just makes more sense to only send a fraction of the people instead of the whole army. Because otherwise, there's a difference between a margin of safety on the one hand and absolute overkill on the other. And so they're trying to be efficient here, just employ a number of people that is enough to get the job done, but not unnecessarily numerous. So, what happened to the men first sent by Joshua to conquer Ai? And how did Joshua react to this? So what happened? They fled from him. And how many men died as a result of this? Yes, 36 men. And does this give us some insight into just how small a city Ai is? Because think about it. We've already read it, so that we know that God has withdrawn his favor from Israel, so that they're going to be defeated. If God has decided that you're going to lose, but the bad guys only managed to kill 36 of you, how impressive are your adversaries? Are we talking about the military machine of Ai here? No. This is a piddly little pipsqueak town, and even with God fighting on their side, they only managed to kill 36. So, how did Joshua react to this? Yes, he is disturbed. Could we maybe even describe Joshua's response as even stronger than that?
Almost like a loss of a loved one in the morning. Tearing the clothes and throwing the dust on all of us.
Yes, that is exactly it. That what Joshua is going through here is he is going through a mourning ritual. That he is just taken aback by this. And what does he say to God? What's his... Yeah, God, why have you done this to us? We could have been just fine on the other side of the Jordan, but it's obvious that we've come over here and our enemies, they're just going to kill us all. Does that seem like maybe a little bit of an overreaction? Because, yes, you had 36 men die, but, I mean, that means that Joshua has got about, 599,964 left. So, any modern day general, if you have an army of 600,000, you lose 36 of them in a defeat, most generals would just say, well, you can't make an omelet without breaking eggs. And so why is Joshua so distraught? Brother Smith.
Maybe it's because they took the fortified city of Jericho with no loss of life. And as God was on their side, they would do it when he told them. Now, he probably didn't know himself what had happened inside the camp where it had happened different times. That somebody had taken someone's spoil.
Yes. Yes. I agree with you. I think there are at least two things that are working here. That on the one hand, this is very different from the experience with Jericho, isn't it? Because with Jericho, did any of the Israelites get so much of the hangnail? No. They just basically walked into the city and had everything all their own way. So was that how Joshua was expecting things to go? Yeah. And so when they go up against Ai, which is a much less impressive opponent than Jericho, and they lose, then obviously that's very surprising. Tony?
The way the people reacted, they had some people also said they melted like water. So their condition may have had some people really.
Yes. This is a big morale attack, isn't it? Because after crossing the Jordan, after defeating Jericho, how did the Israelites feel? Yeah, we're invincible. Nobody can stop us. And so they're coming in with that attitude. And then they go against Ai, and they get whipped. And so then all of a sudden they're down in the dumps. And since college football season is right around the corner, I'm going to make my first third college football comparison. It would be like if this were a year when the Vols were expecting to have a really good team, and then they go out and they lose the first game of the season to Tennessee Martin or somebody. Then how does that make you feel? Yeah, that is the truth, although it is actually Mizzou who is playing Tennessee Martin. I don't know the Vols schedule. But yeah, it's the same thing. And don't you see that on the internet, how you have these incredibly bipolar swings? We've lost, and now we're going to go 0-12, first time in Tennessee history. It's all over. And usually things are never as good or bad as they look in the first game of the season, but people react as though they are. And so I think you see the same sort of thing happening here. So not only are the Israelites down in the dumps, but their enemies are emboldened because now the Israelites don't look invincible anymore. So anything else that's going on here? Harvey? Absolutely it. And there, I think, is the fundamental reason why Joshua reacts the way that he does. What does Joshua know about their previous successes? Who is responsible? Yes. They crossed the Jordan because of God. They defeated the city of Jericho and conquered Jericho because of God. And now if you go up and you lose to the University of Ai pipsqueaks, then what does that say about God's blessing on you? Yes, you need some humility, and it says that God is now on the other team's side, doesn't it? And so you put all that together. And even though it might seem like Joshua's reaction here is overwrought, that he's blowing this way out of proportion. Really, it's not. Because if things continue as they are going now, then in fact the children of Israel are going to get annihilated. That he correctly says, that this is an inflection point. Things could go very badly from here on out. And God, why have you put us on this track to ruin? So, that's Joshua's perspective. God, why have you taken us so far only to let us down? And what's God's response? Israel has sinned. And does God seem real sympathetic to Joshua's viewpoint here? Nope. Well, what's the first thing he says? Get up. I know it's not a funny story, but that always has to make me chuckle. Because it's like when one of your kids is having a temper fit and they're all writhing around down on the ground. Get up. What are you doing down there? And that is basically the way that God is treating Joshua. That the problem here is not a God problem, and of course it never actually is a God problem. Instead, this is an Israel problem. Israel has sinned. Does this mean that Israel has they've fallen into sexual immorality or something? What's the sin? Keeping something that was banned. Do any of your what do your various translations there in verse 11 say about the things that were taken? One says banned. Any of you have some other readings there? The accursed things. Yeah, devoted things. Banned, accursed, devoted. How does that work? Well, because we think of devoted as being a good thing, right? Being devoted to an idol, a la Jezebel, that's not a good thing. But generally, it's a word with positive connotations as opposed to banned and accursed. Yes, it is a good thing in the proper hands. But how can it be that all of these English words that are so different in meaning are translated from the same Hebrew word?
Well, the verse goes on to say that Israel has stolen something from God.
Yeah, they've stolen, they've lied, but in all these cases, it gets back to these banned, accursed, or devoted things. How is it that you can have banned and accursed and devoted mean the same thing? Doug?
It's perspective. Devoted to God, therefore you can't have it. It's banned and accursed to you, therefore you can't have it. It's something that doesn't belong to you.
Yes. Yes, that is exactly it. That these devoted things, all of the metal was devoted to God. It went into the treasury of the tabernacle. But what happened to all of the stuff that wasn't metal? What happened to it that was captured in the sack of Jericho? Burned. And so you have stuff that was devoted to God, and you have other stuff that is devoted to destruction. And then if you took it, it was accursed. Dr. Clifford, and you, sir. Yes?
This is certainly a great lesson to us who are the Israel of today. We have got to keep sin out of the camp here at Transcontinental.
Absolutely. And that's a point that Sean made a couple weeks ago when he preached on exactly this story. The idea is that we have to be aware that, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians, that a little leaven leavens the whole lump. And we will return to that point again, I'm sure, before the class is over. Yes, sir.
I kind of along with what you just said there, but we as humans a lot of times say, why is everybody being punished for what one person did? Or you think more than one person in the camp of Israel there knew what had happened, that he had done that, and just kept it quiet?
There's no evidence that anybody outside of Achan's family knows what is going on. Yes, because surely if they'd helped cover it up, then they would have been punished too. No, as far as I can tell, The 36 men who die, they're completely innocent. They have no part in this matter. They are suffering because of the sin of another. So the problem is that somebody has stolen these. You had a comment, Tony?
I was going to say that, think about it, Joshua should have known there's something, there's sin in the camp. God had told him that if you're faithful to me, if you obey me, nobody will stand before you. So he should have known something's wrong. It seems like he doesn't realize it. He just doesn't realize it.
That's an interesting point. That there is certainly a sense in which Joshua should have gone farther than he did. Joshua, you almost get the impression that Joshua thinks God has done something wrong, don't you? God, you've let us down. You're not keeping your promises. And yet, the reality is that it's not God who has been unfaithful. It is Israel who has been unfaithful. So even somebody like Joshua here is not doing the math right from the very beginning, is he? That he is not reaching the correct conclusion about what the source of the problem is. Jeff?
I was just going to say, this shows us too, you can't hide anything from God. This is something that maybe only Achan knew about. I mean, we don't even know if his family knew about it. But God knew about it.
Yes, just as it says in the law, be sure your sin will find you out. And it always does, doesn't it? And sometimes people can keep sin hidden and quiet for a good long time. The really unfortunate ones keep it hidden and quiet until they die. But 99% of the time, that is not the case. That no matter how carefully we conceal the evil that we are doing, sooner or later that will come back to bite us. And that is another one of the great lessons of this story. Because as of Joshua 7:1, Achan thinks he's gotten away clean. But the reality is going to prove to be very different.
I feel sorry for the rest of his family. They all have to be killed too,
They did, except, if Dad is digging a hole in the middle of the tent and he's burying all this stuff in it that he's not supposed to have, and you don't tell anybody about that, then that makes you complicit in the sin. There's actually a passage in Deuteronomy that talks about this, about how even if your best friend calls to you to come worship an idol with him, or even if your wife or your husband does that, you have to turn them in, you have to be the first to stone them. And there is another lesson too, that when we engage in covering up somebody else's sin, that we know that some Christian is engaged in wrongdoing, but we remain quiet about that because of the family or friendship or whatever, then what does that mean for us spiritually? That we share in their guilt, that we are participating with them in their sin. Absolutely.
And then there's a process, if they don't change from it.
Yes.
You have saved a brother's soul by discussing it with them and acting right from it.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, it's not like the first time we see somebody sin, we have to run up to the microphone on Sunday morning and say, hey, everybody, I have an announcement to make. But it is the question of what our reaction is going to be. Are we going to excuse the sin? Are we going to tolerate the sin? Or are we going to make them confront their sin? And then take that as far as Matthew 18 requires us to. Sorry.
Like I said before, that our God is a particular God, and He does something that's the way He wants to be. Men like to make a light of something. So that's just a small thing, or like
Uzzah is the guy you want. Yes. That you had Uzzah struck dead just for trying to do a good thing. Because, Uzzah is a much more sympathetic character than Achan, isn't he? Achan is a thief. Uzzah, he just wants to help. He's one of David's guys. And so he's trying to help, and he studies the ark to keep it from tipping over. And boom, God strikes him dead. And that might seem like overreaction to us, but it does not seem so to God. And so too, with these 36 men who die, is it right for God to curse the whole nation of Israel so that you have men who die because of a sin that they didn't even commit? But once again, I think that shows us just how serious a thing sin is in the eyes of God. That even if we might be inclined to excuse or make light of sin, God does not. So, Don?
It seems like ever since having left Egypt, Israel has become the petulant adolescent and remains in that particular part of development where well, it's not my fault. I didn't know that this. Why should I be punished? Time after time after time, this little petulant child pops up.
And I think we can probably broaden that out a little bit, can't we? Because Don is talking about what we see as sort of this petulant immaturity in the way that Joshua reacts to this news. But let's be honest, friends. How often when it comes to our lives do we react in a petulant and immature way to the things that happen to us? And this, I think, because really, when you look at Israel in the book of Joshua, this is about as good as Israel ever gets. This is one of their spiritual high points. And yet, you still see that human nature shining through. And so, too, it is even with Christians today, that we all struggle, I think, at times to look at a situation as wisely and maturely as we should. All right. Don't see any other hands. Harvey, I stand corrected.
You know, this reminds me a little bit when we use our own way of doing things, because it's like God has commanded to do. Reminds me a little bit of Saul. He saved the best from God, so he could other to destroy all of them.
Yes, I think you're right to draw that parallel, Harvey. This reminds us a lot of what we see in 1 Samuel 15, where Saul is told to destroy the Amalekites, but instead he spares King Agag and he spares the best of their flocks. He says it's to offer sacrifice to God. I'm not convinced of that. So a similar thing. You have what seems like an extreme instruction from God, and somebody thinks that they know better. Really, we don't have to do that. Anybody else? Okay, the second part of the question. Sean is going to be so proud of me. What would have to be done before God would help Israel again? What is the cure for the disease here? What's that? Yes. Going to have to destroy the devoted things from among you. And what does this destruction now entail? I mean, obviously they're going to have to deal with the loot in a godly way, but who else or what else is now devoted to destruction? Yes, those who had committed this sin, who had brought disgrace on all of Israel by the things that they had done. And so you've got a serious problem, and the remedy is equally extreme. So, who was harboring sin in the camp of Israel? Who was the wrongdoer here? Achan. Yes, Achan is the one who is harboring sin in the camp. And how is this discovered? Yes. Achan ultimately confesses. Is this that Joshua lines all 600,000 of them up in front of him and says, okay, thief, step forward? Now, how does it go? Yeah, you have casting lots. You have all going through by tribe and by family and by household until finally the lot falls on Achan. And what does Joshua say to him? Yeah, give God the glory. And it's an interesting phrase, isn't it? Because it sounds kind of worshipy to us, but for them it was an idiom to tell the truth. Actually, one of the other places where that shows up is in John 9, in the story of Jesus healing the blind man, the man who was born blind. That if you'll recall, there's a point in this story when the Pharisees go and bring the formerly blind man before them, and they say, give glory to God, we know that this man is a sinner. And in that story, the implication is, we don't know what kind of game you and Jesus are running together, but we know that there is some kind of game. Fess up, tell us the truth about how this happened. This can't be a miracle because Jesus is not a good man. So, rather than accepting the proof of the miracle, they are reasoning backward from the conclusion that they have already formed about Jesus to deny the miracle. It is interesting logic. So we see the phrase also used in that way here. So Achan is our man, and what does Achan say he has done? He had sinned specifically by doing what? What? He coveted, that there's his motivation, and because of his covetousness, what did he do? Yes, specifically how? Yes. Tough to sin against anybody but God, I guess. But what specifically did he take? Yes. What's that? Yeah, he saw it and coveted it and took it. And what did he take? Yeah, there we go. Yes, he saw some really nice stuff there in the ruins of Jericho, and he took it for himself because of covetousness. Here I think we see the spotlight being shown on a sin that we don't normally put on the list of big, bad, destructive sins. Because, you know, how many of us here have ever seen someone withdrawn from for covetousness? Yeah, this one tends not to be the sin that we would cast in the role of the sin that has led to God's people being alienated from him. And yet, what can we learn from this story about how significant a problem covetousness is? Yes, that even though it might seem like one of those respectable sins to us, the reality is that covetousness and the actions that proceed from covetousness, a concern for wealth more than for God, a concern for wealth more than other people, this is something that God considers worthy of death. And so, I preached on this a month or two ago, and I will encourage us all once again to consider ourselves and ask whether the evidence of covetousness is apparent in our lives. And recognize from the story of Achan just how badly covetousness can twist us up just like it twisted Achan up. So, anything else on that?
Only time we ever see that this happen, where does this happen in a congregation where one man is locked up and another man is not, or vice versa, they end up with divorce and all that helping out God. That has happened in the church. We have to be aware of it.
Yeah, I think that's true, because of course when we're talking about covetousness in a law of Moses sense, we can also be talking about coveting a woman who does not belong to you. And all of us have probably seen many more examples of sexual sin in the church than we would ever want to see. So their covetousness we see taking on a more familiar form. But I can't think, or can't even recall having heard of a brother getting withdrawn for being flat out greedy and money loving. Jack?
Sometimes we categorize the sin.
We do.
And is this greater than this, or there may be greater consequences for a particular sin over another. But we have to realize ultimately it's a transgression of God's law. That's what all sinning against our God. He specified what we're to do and not to, what we're not to do. And the example is transgression of God's law.
I think that is definitely right, that we should, this underscores the dangers of covetousness as a transgression against God. But let's explore that idea of categorizing sin a little bit, because I think that there is biblical support for the idea of some sins being greater or more serious than others, even though every sin will separate us from God. There are still some that God looks at with even more disfavor than the others. But when we're considering that idea of greater and lesser sins, where do we need to put covetousness? Yes, I think so. That scripturally speaking, from beginning to end, covetousness is a more serious problem than maybe we want to admit because we live in such a materialistic society. For instance, when the Bible talks about why it is that Israel and Judah were carried off into captivity, there are a couple of main sins that were the reason for that. I'll give you the first one. It's idolatry. So that they were carried off because of idolatry. And then there's another one that the prophets mention almost as frequently as idolatry, as the justification for God saying, all right, you all can't stay in the land anymore, you must go. Anybody know what it is? Not intermarriage. That tends to, although that also appears, you're not wrong. It tends to be kind of folded into idolatry because they intermarried and then they committed idolatry. Oppression of the poor, over and over and over again in the prophets. The Israelites are rebuked for not treating the poor among them properly, that instead richer Israelites were doing whatever they could to oppress poorer Israelites. And why do you do that? If you are rich and you have all this money, then why do you oppress the poor to get even more money? It's covetousness.
If you are really deeply practicing that, your son is going to do the same thing. And his son will have it. And it will be multi-generational because eventually it doesn't seem wrong because we've done it forever.
And what's more, can you be covetous under color of law? Can you oppress poor people in a way that is completely legal? Absolutely. You have all those payday loan places. I think that's exactly what they are doing. They are perfectly legal, although they try to stamp them out periodically. But that is just taking advantage of the poor and ignorant and desperate. It's a shameful thing. And I think we see this in Jesus' condemnation of the Pharisees when he says, these are people who devour widows' houses. I don't think the point is that the Pharisees are coming in the dark of night and just grabbing the poor widow and throwing her out. I think the idea is that this poor woman has no means to support herself, and so she just goes deeper and deeper into debt until finally they take her house and throw her on the street. So let's be aware, friends, that many business practices that we see in this country, they are squarely part of the biblical definition of covetousness. Any other comments? Harvey.
I think probably for the last couple of months, we moved with this covetousness to its core because these people that were seeking political positions, all these ads that run around on TV, some of them are true, some of them are deceptive, some of them are just pure lies, try to get these positions that somebody desires.
And that, I think, is a slightly different variety of covetousness. I don't know enough, and it's not really my business here anyway, to pass judgment on which politician is or is not telling the truth. But yes, if you are lying and deceiving for the sake of attaining some political office, then you too have fallen prey to covetousness. Tony? I think it gets back to what it makes you do, because obviously all of us who have jobs or who have ever had jobs, we do what we do because we want to get paid, right? And there's not anything wrong with that. But the question becomes whether we are willing to move from honest work and helping our employer, things that the Bible commends, to taking advantage of others, to deceiving others, to harming others, to abandoning our relationship with God for the sake of money. That covetousness is often something that is best observed in its fruits. Other thoughts or questions? Yes, absolutely. It's like Jesus says in, about Matthew 15, about how the sin does not originate with what comes into you. Sin originates with what comes out of you. That every sin that exists comes from a corrupt heart. And covetousness is certainly one of the ways in which our hearts can become corrupt, even if it is more culturally acceptable than perhaps lust. Jeff? Yes. Yes, you have obviously covetousness of a woman who belongs to someone else leading to sexual immorality. But also covetousness leading to callous unconcern for others. And having no thought for the consequences of our actions and how those actions will negatively affect others, and just sort of going through life doing stuff because we can. Dr. Clifford.
Well, kind of continue this thought about desire. Number one thing that you have to do to be an elder is desire the position. So you have to be, as a man who may desire the position, but you don't want to cut it, that can become a problem in the church. It's hard to discern who's cutting that position and who's desire.
That is a great point, because even in the, we often think of covetousness with respect to money, but even when we're talking about position in the church, if you are coveting the office of elder, a lot of the time that fruit can become evident too late, can't it? And it is tough to see what's going on there until it bears fruit. So that is something to be watchful for, and for those of us who may desire the position someday, and it is good to be careful when we consider others. All right, I think I heard the bell, didn't I? No? Yes, okay, we heard the bell, alas. Did not quite get to the end of the chapter, but we had a very good discussion along the way, so thank you all.